Okay, chapter 12. Um, in this chapter, we're going to talk about investigation as it pertains to obtaining a search warrant and then executing the search warrant. Um, Things that you need to take into consideration as law enforcement, and this applies very much to the law enforcement side. This really has nothing to do with corporate security, private security, things such as that. So we're going to start out and go through the objectives here real quick. And your objectives are: explain and understand the search warrant process, identify hardware and storage that you're potentially going to be able to collect, explain and understand the legal standards and best current practices for documentation, explain and describe the best current practices for collection, preservation, transportation, and storage of electronic evidence, explain and describe the best current practices for collection and distinguish between single scene, multi-scene, and crimes. Communicate an understanding of network architecture and standards relevant to network investigations, identify sources of assistance for multiple scene and network operations, identify categories of evidence, and then broadly outline the procedures for preserving and collecting network. So we got a lot to cover, and there's a lot of information in this slide set, so let's get going. All right, so first of all, we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities. And we have different categories of people. So for example, we have first responders, investigators, forensic analysts, private police / corporate security, subject matter experts. So we have different levels of people doing different things. And when you first start talking about computer crime or crime scene collection, we're talking about the first responder. And the first responder, that's our cop. That's the guy that's on the guy or girl that's on the beat out there that runs across something that is digital or is evidence. Okay, it doesn't have to be digital, obviously. If they walk across, anything that is of a criminal nature, the first responder is going to identify that. But the first responder's responsibility is to protect, and make sure that your evidence is not destroyed in any way. First responders also are typically where we lose our evidence, if we're going to lose evidence in digital forensics. First responders have a bad habit of touching the evidence, playing with the evidence, going through going through cell phones, touching blood, touching DNA, walking through things that they shouldn't be walking through. So especially a new police officer, we run into a lot of issues when it comes to that kind of stuff. But the first responder, again, it's their responsibility to be on the scene first. It's their responsibility to collect not collect, but to protect the evidence. Then we have our investigator. And the investigator is typically the second person on the scene. Now, the investigator may be the same person. Depending on the size of your department, you may have multiple people that are assigned as both a first responder and an investigator. So the first responder gets on the scene and then calls the investigator. Again, depending on your department size, you may have the same person doing both jobs. So you may not have the luxury of multiple people. But the investigator's job is to come in, evaluate what they have, and then tell basically the first responder or the collection team, the CSI team, etc., what we need to get. You saw this happen in Ferguson, which actually caused a huge issue because the first responders were not able to collect the body, and the body stayed on the ground for probably 8 hours waiting for the CSI truck to show up, and the investigators to show up to start the process, because they had to call St. Louis County PD, Sheriff's Office, and St. Louis County Sheriff's Office had to send their CSI truck. And the reason I get them mixed up is because St. Louis County is actually St. Louis County Police. They're a unique organization. Then we have our forensic analysts. And forensic analysts, these are people that have a unique specialty. We have our blood analysts, we have DNA analysts, we have our hard drive analysts, our cell phone analysts. You may have a very specific or tailored role that you're working in. There are very few general forensic analysts because there is a lot of education that's required to be a forensic analyst. It's very tough to be or to get into being that expert or that forensic analysis. Um, these guys are technical experts. They're going to tell you um, what is the fact, and that's what I want a forensic analyst to do. I don't ever want the forensic analyst to testify to their opinion. I want them to testify to the fact. Tell me the inculpatory and exculpatory evidence. It means that the person is guilty. Show me the things that are making this guy guilty or a girl guilty. If they're innocent, show me the things that make them innocent. It's not my job to put someone in jail. It's my job to prove that something either happened or it didn't happen. I'm supposed to go both ways on this. Um, and then we have our private police and corporate security. And private police and corporate security, basically, they might be consultants or they might be something like that. We typically don't have them involved in the law enforcement process. The private police and corporate security are not law enforcement, and there's a sometimes they get confused on their role, especially if you don't specify it clearly to them and tell them exactly what you want them to do. You may end up with the private security acting like a police officer, and that can cause you problems later in court. And then our corporate security, trust me, if you're going to hit Bank America or if you're going to go into somewhere that has a security department, you're going to be dealing with private security. And everybody at Bank America is going to know that you just showed up. You're going to have to badge in, or you're going to have to get badged in. You're going to have to go find the server farm. You identify who it is you're there to look at. I mean, there's just a whole ream of things that you're going to have to do when you're dealing with corporate security or a large organization that has corporate security. I'm not going to go into Bank of America, kick the door, and say, search warrant, we're here to take you down. It just doesn't happen that way. There are way too many protocols and things in place to prevent me from just walking in and doing something like that. And then we have our subject matter experts. And subject matter experts, for example, I'm a Department of Defense expert witness, a Department of Justice expert witness, and I testify in court on specific things. Subject matter expert it has a specialty. Mine is cell phones and DOS file structure. So I can testify to either one of those, and I've been qualified in court to teach on either one of those. So subject matter expert, very very specific what it is that I'm testifying to, what it is that I am allowed to testify to, and if I get too broad, I can cause myself great harm. For example, if I go in and I say I'm a computer expert, the very first question of the defense attorney, because this is a great one for the defense attorney, first thing what he's going to do, he's going to throw out and say, okay, well, what's the file structure of an IBM VAC 9650 from the 1958 IBM server? And you go, I have no idea what that old architecture, and they'll say, well, I thought you were an expert in all computers. Well, and next thing you know, you're doing this whole dance and you're going to get disqualified. So subject matter experts need to be very clear what it is they're doing, what it is they're testifying to, what they're testifying about, and they need to stay in their lane. Sometimes prosecutors try to get them to leave their lane and talk about something else, and the investigators got to go back and say, nope, sorry, we got to get right back into talking about what it is that we're supposed to be talking about, because I can't testify on all computers. I can testify on what it is that I'm qualified on. So now we're talking about the search warrant. So now you know all the different roles and we've got our people doing stuff. Now we have our search warrant. The search warrant allows us to vacate the rights of a person so that I can go in and look at whatever I want to look at. So take that back, whatever the search warrant allows me to look at. So what that means is I'm asking the court to basically violate your constitutional rights to allow the government to come in and go through your stuff. Well, to do that, you have to have probable cause and you have to have justification. So I have to fill out an affidavit to the court, and I have to tell the court, this is what I'm looking for, this is why I want to do what I want to do, and this is my reason behind why I think suspect XYZ is guilty, and this is why I think there will be evidence in his house or in his car, pockets, on his cell phone, in his computers, etc. So, for example, when I was doing we were doing drug cases, we would go out with the drug teams because the drug teams would typically come across a computer where the guy bought all of his glassware. He would buy his pharmaceutical drugs. He would keep track of recipes, just all kinds of stuff would be on the computer. So we would testify to the court and say, based on our past experience, there's always been computers, and these computers hold these types of records, and we believe that these types of records would be useful for us in the prosecution of this case. And the court will say yes or no. We think you have probable cause to go in. But because I have probable cause and a search warrant doesn't mean I get to go in and look at everything. For example, there's a rule called don't look for the shotgun in a shoebox. And what that means is if I have a search warrant and I say I'm looking for let's say a long rifle, and the long rifle's 5 feet long, and that's the weapon I'm looking for, there's very little likelihood that I'm going to find it in a shoebox in the closet. So when I'm doing my search or my search warrant and I'm going through the house, and if my search warrant is for a certain thing and I put in the long rifle and I look in the shoebox and find drugs, well, I'm probably going to lose that evidence because I'm exceeding the scope of my investigation. I'm looking in places that evidence could not be placed. So I have to be very careful on what it is I'm searching for and what it is my search warrant says that I can do, so I don't violate the scope of my warrant, so I don't accidentally get myself in trouble with the court. Because if I get in trouble with the court, let's say, for example, I do find that shoebox, and I open that shoebox and there's drugs in there. Well, that's great. But what attaches then is something called the fruits of the poisonous tree. So I take that evidence and I start finding more evidence, and I eventually find everything I need. Maybe I even find the shotgun or the long rifle. Well, the defense attorney is going to come back and say, well, that's great, but you violated the scope of your warrant when you opened that shoebox. So everything that was found after that, or anything that you used from that shoebox that led you to further evidence, is going to be needs to be excluded. Now the court can do two things. And the court can say, look, when the police were in there, inevitably they would have found that shoebox. So yes, they made a mistake, but the likelihood that they would have found that in the course of their investigation is pretty good. So therefore, I'm going to allow that to stay on the record. The second half of that is the court comes back and says, nope, bad police officer. You are trained to do the right thing. You did the wrong thing, and since you did the wrong thing, you're going to lose this evidence. And that's the second way that you can have your evidence taken from you. So again, fruits of the poisonous tree, once that attaches, it becomes a bad day for your evidence, because a lot of your evidence is going to get lost. And that's usually it's a very unfortunate thing, because sometimes a small mistake can cost a lot. So when I'm looking into the computer, or into the computers and things such as that, I can ask to look in an entire computer, or I might be restricted by the court to only look in certain areas. And the reason that happens is when you have a communal computer, 5 or 6 profiles on there, you may have one person that has access only to a small portion of that computer. So I can't look at all the other profiles. I can only look at the profile of the person that I'm actually looking at. And I can be restricted. And the scope of my warrant can actually restrict me down to only certain components or parts of that hard drive, or that evidence that I wish to go and look at. Secondly, if I request too strict of a search, I may lose stuff. So I might be looking at an Xbox or a PlayStation or a computer, and I don't put that exactly in I just say computer. Or if I'm being too strict, I say an IBM computer system. Well, if I do that, well, now I can't look at the Xbox. Now I can't look at the PlayStation. Now I can't look at these other devices that are on the network. So I want to make sure that I don't write it too narrow, but I can't write it so broad that I say I'm looking for anything everywhere, because that also is too much for the court, and the court will say, no, you need to be more specific. For example, if I walk up in front of an apartment complex and say, Your Honor, I'm sure someone in there is doing something illegal. I want a search warrant to go through all the apartments and look for illegal stuff that I'm positive is going on in there. Well, the court's going to say, yeah, that's not going to happen. So be specific. Tell me what apartment. Tell me what the crime is. Tell me more about it. I wrote a search warrant one time where I knew that the individual had child pornography in Word documents that he was sending out. We'd already had received a few, so we knew what we were looking for. Went into the search warrant, asked for a search, and I knew that I would have to look at Word documents, so I put in there, I was requesting Word documents, and I specified Word documents, and that's, or Word, or excuse me, I specified document. I didn't specify Word document, I just said document. Well, we get to court, and there's a Microsoft guy there for the defense. He's their expert witness. And I sat down and I went through my thing, and the defense attorney says, "Well, why did you produce these pictures? We don't understand why the pictures are here." And I said, "Well, as I was going through the documents, I was able to find these pictures." And the defense attorney said, "Well, why were you looking for pictures in documents?" I said, "Well, that's part of my investigation." And he said, "No. Your search warrant says that you were looking through documents." I said, "Yes, and that's what I was doing." And he said, "Nope, that's all I need." And now I'm going to bring up my expert witness. So the expert witness gets on the stand and he says, "Was the investigator looking at documents?" He said, "No. Actually, what he was looking at is two different files. He was looking at the document, which is the textual portion of the Word, and then he was looking at the pictures, which are what are called object link embedded files, or OLE files, which are added to the document, and it makes up a document when you print it, review it, whatever. But they are two separate files. So therefore, when he reviewed the Word documents, he left the textual based Word and he went and looked at the pictures. And I lost my evidence. Very, very simple. But when I look back on it, they were absolutely correct. Now I have more experiences back in 2000s. Now I have more experience and understand, why. Now I understand what, can and can't be done. And then you have, external media, which is your cloud storage and thumb drives, all that kind of stuff, handheld devices like your cell phone, and then networking equipment. And you may not be taking all this stuff, to be honest with you. You may get a search warrant and they may say, yeah, you can go after, the network equipment, but you can't take it. You can review it. You can review their logs, things like that, because there's no need for you to take the physical device. And the physical device is something that company needs to keep functioning. So image out what you need to image out, and then leave the device there. So, just because I have a search warrant doesn't mean I get to take everything. For example, you back to Bank America. So I get into their Bank America server farm, and on the 15th floor, somebody's doing some bad stuff. One person out of the 20,000 employees, I'm not going to go into Bank America and start taking down their server farm, because the damage that I will cause to Bank America, one, and their ability to conduct business, two, far exceeds any value that I'm going to get from that small bit of evidence or that container that I'm going to be able to take down. And if I did take down Bank America, my department or the prosecutor or whoever would be liable for the loss or the damage caused by my actions. So I've got to be very careful, especially in large business organizations, when you're working there. All right. So when you're going in and you're doing your executing your search, first thing you're gonna do, and a lot of this you'll look at it and go, well, this kind of makes sense because this is what I would do. First thing I'm gonna do is, make sure that you're safe. Make sure that the bad guy's not gonna nut up on you and start shooting you, or stabbing you, or any of the other crazy things that have happened. My buddy, a very good friend of mine, was in Redondo Beach Police Department, and he went. They kicked the door, and it was on an identity theft, a real low end. It probably would end up being a misdemeanor. But when they did, the guy just happened, not because they planned it this way, but just happened to be in the bathroom. So he wasn't near his computer. But right next to his computer was a loaded 12-gauge shotgun and a couple other handheld weapons. And he had told the police officers that he had every intent on defending himself when the police came in. So just because it's a it's a identity theft or some low end crime, doesn't mean the guy's not going to defend himself. It doesn't mean he's not going to do everything he can to protect himself from going to jail. So one of the things you got to remember when you're going into a scene or going in, safety first. When you're kicking that door and you're walking up, you take every warrant like it's going into an armed conflict, because you never know what you got. We lost a good friend in the sheriff's department. He was walking up to a door. For whatever reason, the guy had a bad day. He nutted up, came out, and put a shotgun into the deputy's chest, just because it just happened to be that day. He just happened to be having a bad day. So you never know what's going to happen. So you got to be very, very careful. Then you want to secure the scene. So once you get in, you've made sure you're safe. You made sure your people are safe, and then you want to secure the scene. You want to secure your environment. You want to make sure your evidence is safe. You want to make sure that all the people that are on the scene stay on the scene. Just because there's a bunch of people there and you go in and they say, "Oh, hey, later, Bob. I don't want to be here." Nobody leaves at that point. Everybody stays until you have either evaluated them as a witness, suspect, a victim, or they just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So when you're going through and you're stepping through your priority concerns and you're securing the scene, again, nobody leaves the scene. Again, you've got to evaluate everybody at the scene. Everybody's a potential suspect, witness, and you've got to make sure that nobody's touching things, turning or activating Bluetooth or something that will cause a computer to start doing something destructive. You got to prevent that kind of thing from happening. And then you got to make sure that everybody is doing what you tell them to do. If a computer is off, leave it off. If a computer is on, evaluate the computer, make sure that the computer does not have destructive activity going on it, and then you can evaluate the computer. If it's got destructive activity going on, pull the cord from the back of the computer and shut the computer down. But you've got to make sure that you are evaluating those computers one by one. Again, if the computer is off, leave it off. That's the best rule of thumb. If the computer is on, then evaluate the computer, make sure it's not doing anything bad, defragging, wiping, some type of nefarious, stuff that's going on. Pull the plug. If it's not, let it run and document it and see what's on the screen. You never know. You might find something on the screen that's very important. You may find a note, or you may find a Word document that hasn't been saved yet. So you might find something that you can catalog by picture on the screen that hasn't been cataloged onto the drive yet, or maybe is not in the RAM that's easily found. So we want to try and capture things that are on the screen. You can also show tools that are on the screen through this process. So again, you go in, safety, security, and then just make sure everything is handled correctly. And we're following that CPERS model. And I mentioned this earlier. Collection, preservation, examination, reporting. That's the CPER model. That's the DOJ model, and that's the model we're going to follow as we go through and we bag and tag. Collection, protection, examination, and or preservation, examination, and reporting. All right, let's continue on. Okay, so once we've identified the crime scene, we're making sure nothing is altered on those computers. Nothing needs to be changed on those computers. And if anything is changed, you're going to get questioned about it later in court. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to document. We're going to document. 90 seconds of high-end action and coolness is going to lead to 12 hours of paperwork later on. So we're going to make sure we document that crime scene. And you're going to document it with either a camera, you're going to document it by drawing, you're going to document it verbally or into a recorder with a video recorder. You're going to document it somehow. But basically, at the end of your collection, you should be able to step back, take all your pictures and notes, and completely reconstruct the scene exactly as if that person or that scene was in your office. So you should be able to put the computers back together. You should be able to put everything back together as if you were at the scene. So you can show later on, if the court says, set this computer up because we need to see it in action, well, you might have to do that. There's one instance I remember, it wasn't my case, it was another guy's case, but somebody saw the monitor from about 10 feet away and called the police and said, hey, I just walked by this cubicle and I saw on the monitor they had some, what looked like child pornography. And when the police got there, so when this guy went to trial, they took that computer and he set that computer up and then he moved it 10 feet away from the jury and they said, can you see the screen? Can you tell child pornography is on the screen? And it was a very effective tool. So there may come a time where you have to set that computer back up to show what it is the reporting party could see or not see when they collected. Also see or not see what the actual evidence looks like. So documentation is huge. We're also going to bag and tag to collect the evidence, and we're going to send the evidence back in some type of container. All the evidence collection activities may be called later into court. You may get questioned on anything and everything you've done on that thing. And if you don't have a checklist, and I'm going to show you a checklist, not this slide, next slide, but one after. There's a checklist, and if you look in your book as well on page 280, you'll see basically a workflow checklist. This takes us through from top to bottom. But you also have, like the National Institute of Justice, they have great documents online. You can download their PDFs. The NIJ does a great job of putting out good books. In fact, the criminals usually have a good library of their books because the criminals download their books just like we do, so they can see what it is that we're going to go look for, so they can get rid of, or prevent us from being able to see it. And it's called anti-forensics, and it's the process of preventing us from being able to get on and see stuff. And like I said before, after we've done that, we're gonna pack, we're gonna transport the evidence. You never know what you're gonna end up with. We were in Arkansas. We took down a house, and we were looking for evidence on the computers, and we couldn't find the computer, and then finally, a guy from the kitchen yells up and said, "Hey, I think I found the computer." And sure enough, in the kitchen was a new LG refrigerator with a screen on the front of it. And when they touched the screen, it turned out to have a Linux operating system on it, and on that computer in the refrigerator, it had all the evidence on it. And the guy was using that as his storage mechanism, thinking that we would never find it or think to look on the refrigerator. And luckily, somebody in our team had the forethought to look on the refrigerator. But here's the problem: what do you do with a refrigerator? So now we have this refrigerator. We all have sedans. Nobody has the ability to transport this thing. So, we end up going down and getting a U-Haul truck. And then we went to Walmart and got some coolers and ice and took all their stuff out, because you can't leave all of his food undefrosting and damaging the food, because that's a crime. Me destroying your property, I can't do that. So we had to protect it. So we put the refrigerator in the back of the truck, put the food into coolers, he had some medication in there, we put that into coolers, and we arrested him and took his refrigerator, made sure that he had someone come into the house that was going to take care of the coolers after we left. So, again, you just never know what you're going to run into. And then just remember that everything you do on a computer, everything that we do when we're collecting has some type of effect on that computer. Locart's theory. If you touch something, you're going to leave some type of mark or some type of thing. You walk into a room, you're going to leave skin cells in the room. You're going to leave something. You're going to change that environment. So anything you do to a computer actually is going to change that environment, and you may be called into question. For example, you do a search warrant at 10 o'clock, seize the computer at 10 o'clock. And your report says, I seized the computer at 10 o'clock. Well, come 2 o'clock, when you finally are starting to bag and tag and you're doing some closeout, you may have some transactions that happen on the computer. Well, the defense attorney may say, well, why was the computer left on for 2 hours? What did you do? What evidence did you plant on my client's computer? Remember, the defense attorney doesn't care if his guy is innocent or not. He just wants to put doubt into the mind of the jury that you did what you did. And all you got to do is get one person to say, well, I don't know, I don't think, and your case is done. Um, so also when you're doing your evidence, you're going to have some type of worksheet. There's an example of a worksheet on 283, which kind of gives you an idea of how you would document. This is by no, this is just a check sheet. This is a cover sheet. This is by no means a in-depth computer evidence worksheet. This is a very, very minor one. Notice it says page 1 of 2 on the bottom because there's a lot more information that goes on this sheet. So when we get back to the department, we're going to turn our stuff over to our evidence custodian. Evidence custodian is going to put it into the locker, and they're going to store that evidence. And depending on the rules of your state, Missouri, for example, is we had to store evidence for 7 years. So you have to keep evidence in that locker for 7 years past the date of the trial. So, we had stuff in there from, cases way back. Because it may take 4 or 5 years for them to get through the thing. So you may end up holding evidence for 20 years, depending. And evidence rooms fill up. Evidence clerks will tell you, don't bring me everything. Bring me what you need to for a trial. So if a guy has 20 computers and you only need one hard drive, well, you're going to get that hard drive into evidence. The rest stuff you're going to do what's called a return, and you're going to give back to the suspect those things that are not evidential because you don't need them. You don't have to have them. You also need to understand that the evidence custodian, that's his world, that's his domain, and the evidence is, once this goes into his locker, that belongs to him. And you have to go check it out to get it back. And what we do in most forensics, especially computer forensics, is we'll image the drive, make an exact bit-for-bit copy of it, and we work from that, and the actual evidence, the original evidence stays in the storage, or in the evidence container, or excuse me, evidence locker. All right, so we talked about this chart. Again, go back onto 280. You can kind of go through it. It's a very easy chart. It's a workflow. This is a very minimalistic workflow. I'll try to post online the workflow we did from Afghanistan. Much more in-depth workflow. You can get kind of a sense. I just need to clear it, make sure I can. But you get kind of a sense of how complicated extractions can be in different environments. Multiple computers compared to multiple locations and computers as opposed to single environments. Just about everything is networked today. Very, very little is standalone. Everybody has a house router or a business router connected out to the web so they can do the internet. Every device we have in the house basically is being connected to the web. There's a new hair dryer now that's connected to the web, and it does an iTunes and it does some other stuff. So while you're blow drying, instead of listening to the blow dryer, you can hear music. I mean, it's just everything is being connected. And you've got Alexa now that controls your coffee pot and your toaster prints your daily weather on it, and there's an internet connected toaster. So I mean, it's just craziness. But this is the environment you're going to be working in. This is the multiple node house or multiple node kind of system that you're going to be working with. So just understand, it's going to get complex. There's going to be times when you look at it and go, wow, there's just a lot of stuff here. And you're absolutely right. There is a lot of stuff there. And then also understand, investigators don't need to, I don't have to be technically proficient in how networks work. I don't need to be a network engineer. What I need to understand is how networks work. I need to have a base understanding of how the nodes work. I need to have a basic comprehension of how email traffics from A to B, and how people are able to communicate on the web. So when I'm looking at the intranet, I'm looking at my internal network. When I'm looking at the internet, I'm looking at what the internet connects to and gateways out to at some point through my gateway device. The internet allows me access to the rest of the world. or other private entities. Then the bad thing about today, as opposed to when computers first came out, is in the older days you would have an IP address that went to every single computer in your house. So you had a known IP address on every device. So every device you had could be tracked beyond the router. Today in our private networks, we have private addressing. So 192, 10 dot, 169, these are all private addresses that allow us to have multiple networks with a single IP address acting as our connector to the web. And through NAT translation, the computer is able to interact on the web. So the internet and the internet are very important, but again, two very separate, two different. If I have a single scene or a multi-scene crime scene, most of your computer scenes today will be multiple. Either you have an iPhone or Android phone or some phone, and you have a computer. So right there you have two devices. So most scenes are a multiple computer scene. Right now I'm staring at our new computer crime collection lab, and if it's a single computer, it's a good day. Going in, I'm bagging and tagging, I'm going to make it home for dinner. You walk in and you've got multiple computers, you're going to probably call mom and tell her you're not coming home for dinner because you're going to be there for a while. Bagging and tagging computers at a multiple scene, especially if you have a limited amount of people, is going to take a great amount of time. All right, it's not something you just walk in, grab computers, throw them in a bag, and you leave. This is something that you have to plan. You have to have all your evidence tape, all of your collection materials. You're going to bag, you're going to tag, you're going to document, you're going to get all the serial numbers, all the identifiers. You're going to close up drives so they can't be used again. There's just a whole process that goes into the collection of a computer system. So there's a real good video on bagging and tagging, and I will, if it's on YouTube, I will give you guys a link to it so you can see it. When we talk about modeling or network modeling, you have something called the OSI layer. They elude the traditional 7 layers to this OSI model or this investigation model, and they basically say it's kind of the same thing, which I agree with it. You can elude some of this to the OSI, and what they do here is they say that policies and user, those are all human things. Those are all things we interact with, which is absolutely correct. And then the presentation layer, these are your application services. And then you have your transport layer where you transport things across the network. So you're sending things to and from your computer to the other computer or suspect computer. And then you have your network services. This is the actual transportation layer. This is how your computer actually communicates. So when you're looking at computer crimes, investigators pretty much stay in the 7, 8, and 9 range up there. Your forensic analysts and your experts deal with 6 and below, and your SMEs deal with 6 and below. They're the ones that are going to come in and explain how a network works. The forensic analysts are going to be the one that goes in and looks at how the forensics log files were collected and things such as that. And then we have some identifiers, some things that we use when we are collecting evidence on the net. The first 2 are basically identifiers: your MAC address or media access control, and your IP address, your internet protocol address. These are identifiers. So my MAC address, every computer that has a network card, it has a MAC address on it, and you can go in and look at the MAC address. You look on the back of your computer, on the bottom of your computer, you can find the MAC address, and the MAC address is a unique identifier to the computer. So the MAC address and IP address, in coordination with those 2, now I have 2 pieces of evidence that I can correlate to a computer. So I can say this MAC address with this IP address on this date and time was actually the computer that was on the web at that time. So MAC address, IP address, identifiers. The IP address can change depending on the type of network you have. You may have a different IP address every day. You may have a different IP address every 6 days, or you may have a static IP address, means that you never lose that IP address and the IP address stays with you forever. Mostly network equipment, printers, phones in network offices uh, tend to have that type of addressing. Um, I haven't seen lately. I haven't seen computers go static unless you have some need, or servers definitely are static. But usually client machines are DHCP. Then you have DNS, domain name servicing, and what DNS does, just think of DNS like the phone book. You have a name, it gives you a number. Well, what DNS does is when you type in www.utica.edu, the computer has no idea, because the computer doesn't speak English. You got to remember that. The computer has no understanding of what utica.edu is. What the computer knows is you're trying to go to Utica edu. So it's going to use something called domain name service. Then a domain name service is going to tie you to an address or an IP address. So when I do my DNS or my translation, I'm going to type in my English www something, and it's going to then, like a phone book, give me a number for where you want me to go. So again, think of DNS just like a phone book. I want to find Stephen Pearson's phone number so I can call him. I go down until I find Pearson. There's his phone number. I dial that into the computer or into the phone, and I get Steve on the line. DNS the same way. You type in the name of the place you want to go. It finds the IP address of the server where that thing's at, and it sends your computer that way. Now the problem is, if I can do a DNS hack, I can change DNS, so I can actually manipulate DNS, and I can make DNS go different directions. So if you type in whitehouse.com, I can make it go to, or excuse me, whitehouse.gov. I can change the DNS to make it go to whitehouse.com. Give it the IP address, change the IP address in the DNS table, and they call that a DNS hack, and it happens every once in a while. And then we have our point-to-point protocol. And point-to-point protocol, what that does is allows me to connect two computers directly. So when I'm doing Tor, when I'm doing some type of tunneling application, when I'm downloading files, streaming files, things like that, I may be using the point-to-point mechanism. I may be using the the direct connect. So what I'm doing is I'm connecting directly to another computer, and I'm interfacing with that computer through point-to-point. And point-to-point can be more challenging for an investigator if you're trying to capture streaming, or if you're trying to identify someone that's streaming. The point-to-point protocol will throw another layer of complexity in there for you. Unless you have the codec or the encryption for that stream, you may not be able to see it in live time. It all depends. So again, just know that PPP will cause you a little bit of an issue when you're trying to do that type of an investigation. And then we have the hearsay rule, and hearsay basically says, the suspect should have some way of, facing their accuser. So when you bring in these records, they can't really argue log files. They can't really argue your notes, and these become exceptions. So to the hearsay rule, there are certain exceptions, and these exceptions apply in the computer crime world. And one of them is notes that you take as a police officer. You can have notes. If you have business records, and log files are typically business records. Log files, date and timestamps. We use CDRs quite often, which are call detail records from cell phone towers, so we can track where you've been and what you did and how you did it. And then presenting best evidence. And basically what that means is I may not have exactly what it is I was supposed to have, or I may have not gotten it exactly the way it's supposed to have been gotten, but it's the best evidence I can provide, and the court looks at that and says, under the circumstances, you did have some exigent circumstance or some mitigating circumstance, or you had some other reason why that you wanted to, or you needed to present the evidence in this manner. And you typically see that sometimes when you're dealing with large data sets or complicated data sets, where you can't bring the evidence into court, and you do your best to show the court what you can. For example, let's say I was doing an investigation on the space station and somebody wanted to look at the space station. Well, I might be able to show a model of the space station, or I might be able to show depictions of the space station. I can't bring the space station into court, and we can't go to the space station. So there's prevention, there's blocks that prevent us or don't allow us to actually view the evidence in the form or in its natural form. So again, I'm going to present it the best way I can. I'm going to do, again, it's called presenting best evidence, and that's an exception to the hearsay rule, and that exception to the hearsay rule is acceptable in court. All right. So for the last hour, we've basically been going over the search warrant process and the collection process, very much in an overview. Again, this is for a law enforcement. You guys are in your cyber program, which means you're on the civilian side, unless you're made Title 18 or Title 19 by the government, then you become a federal investigator. Just understand there's a lot of things that go into collecting evidence, and people make this mistake all the time that they watch a CSI, they watch NCIS, or, something like that, and they think they become the consummate investigator and they can go do things. There's only one group of people that can collect artifacts for inclusion in court, and that's the police. Even if a private investigator picks something up, he still has to turn it in the police. And there's only one person that can make evidence, and that's a judge. And the judge says it's evidence, it's evidence. And we're going to be following what's called the CPR. Collection, preservation, examination, reporting. In fact, if you don't have, it's not in your book, but that's basically what we deal with in the world today. The CPR rule or CPR model. And again, collection, preservation, examination, and reporting, that is the DOJ standard, and that is what we follow. All right, so with that, I will let you go, and I will see you in the next chapter.